Hi, I'm Scott Cardis. Welcome to this episode of Asia Future Institute Interviews. I'm here with Scott Robinson, CEO of a boutique media agency, OR Comm. Scott, nice to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Scott, tell us about yourself.
Myself?
And then your...
Well, I'm from the United States, New York native. I have a hospitality and media background. I came to Korea many years ago to teach English, like a lot of folks do, and saw a lot of opportunity in both restaurants and media. We founded our company in 2014. We opened our first restaurant very soon thereafter. And then we started working in hospitality media mostly. So working with alcohol companies on brand strategies, advertising campaigns. And as of 2019, we're now working in network television. We have 3 network television shows that we're producing.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. So when you talk about like network television, was that like a conscious choice to jump into network television, or did you want to go with like an online distribution? Were you trying to, is there like a difference in that?
You know, it's funny because it's really evolving a lot. I have a master's in journalism. My background is network news in the United States. And so, you know, as an entrepreneur, you always sort of start with what you know well. And develop some relationships through different business partnerships with local networks, Arirang, JTBC, NBC. But these days, transmedia is really what everyone is talking about, especially post-COVID. So a lot of networks paused their productions in the spring, realized that the advertising dollars went with it over to online because, you know, your YouTubes and your Instagram stories and your TikToks of the world never really saw a pause, and mostly they saw an increase. So you had a lot of major talk shows that went to a YouTube delivery model. More people watch Stephen Colbert on YouTube than they do on CBS now. So I think the conversation is still in the process of changing, whether or not network television even has the clout that it had a year ago. Now everybody suddenly wants to get to the streaming model. You know, Apple's out with one, Disney's out with one, HBO's got one, NBC's got one coming, not to mention the plethora of Korean digital streaming platforms that exist.
So when you say, especially with COVID, that changed a lot of stuff with media. I know, you know, people don't go to movies anymore because they can't, but, you know, Netflix has picked up and all those streaming things. Do you think that trend is going to continue?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, take it back another year, it really started with Me Too. There was a lot of very conservative fiscal management practices that existed in Hollywood and media worldwide. You know, bottom line, it's really expensive to produce a movie. And you need people with a lot of money to weigh in. And oftentimes people with a lot of money are conservative old men. And these are the people that tend to run the industries. The Me Too movement really started to sort of crack the glass on the management practices behind those human beings. And what they saw was a lot of negligence and malfeasance. And then with COVID, all of a sudden, a lot of these production models are going into this streaming service, which changes the finances of it because it's a lot cheaper, it's a lot faster, you can be a lot more transparent with your viewer base. And what you're seeing is not just a transition from the types of leadership, you're also seeing a major transition in the way people are managing money because there's a lot less of it now.
I know, for example, some people with Kpop talk about the predatory contracts that some of these Kpop stars are under. Like, because the way and I know very little about Kpop, to be honest. So, you know, I read these articles that come out about how the producers control like every aspect of their lives. Mm-hmm. Like, what are your thoughts on stuff like that? You know,
I think it's changing. I think when you look at Korean business culture, specifically in the media, you have to account for the fact that it is evolving. You know, I think in the West, going back to this idea of deeply entrenched traditions of the men who control Hollywood, you have to, there's this sort of disclaimer that they're never going to change and the practices are never going to change. If you apply that same disclaimer in a very generalized form, you can make negative arguments about anything anywhere. I think what you have to take a look at instead are positive trends in the industry. Look at Big Hit Entertainment, BTS's agency. They're the fastest growing media agency in the country. They have very transparent and horizontal hiring practices. They themselves have really empowered the artists in a lot of ways. And I think that has led in a very large way to BTS's huge global success. If you look at artists like CL, recently CL came out and challenged her media agency and had a very public feud with the CEO of her company and ended up breaking away and creating her own label. These types of disruptive changes in the industry have a very positive effect, but the disruption itself is always painful. We love to throw this word disruption around, right? We want to be a disruptive industry. Disruptive in itself is a negative terminology. It means it's going to hurt. And I think change is always painful in any industry. But when you work in media and it's so public, that struggle is played out in front of everybody. And that can be a very good and a very bad thing. Bad in that the actors that are involved, and I don't mean actors as in performers, I mean actors as the human beings that have to live that drama publicly. It's very painful for them. But it creates national debate. Look at Sam, the recent incident with Sam from Bijong Samwaidam. He saw online that there were a bunch of students in blackface trying to emulate African burial rituals. He called them out online, and his agency leadership really wanted him to apologize. This show, but that was a painful situation, but it shows that there is now a national debate. It sparked a national conversation, and you see both sides of that conversation very clearly playing out in social media. That's what disruption is. It creates debate that then leads to change. So what he ended up doing will eventually be good because he exposed a very young consumer base to the dangers of racial stereotyping.
What would you say Korea should continue to do to stay on top of the media and the music world? Because, like you said, BTS is the global group right now. And normally it was like a Western group. It's like we some pop stars before, but now it's all K-pop everywhere in the world. What could Korea do to continue to grow and be the number one dog?
I think in Korean management as a social philosophy, there is a lot of emphasis that has always been put on mergers and acquisitions and infrastructural global expansion. Develop institutions overseas that bring money back into the core system in Korea. I don't see a lot of problem with that. A lot of people do. A lot of people call it, corporate imperialism. But I think it's a business model that is almost essential to media success in that you have to put down roots in other places in order to generate influence and revenue from those places. I think CJ is a really great example of a company that is doing that. They've had operations in California for a very long time. Those operations in California are very healthy. Parasite is a very clear example of this. CJ was really the corporate engine behind that, and it was a huge success. I think BTS is now starting to put down roots in California, and that business philosophy is very healthy. And I think more of that is in order. I think there's also a lot of shift now in that the United States is literally toxic and Hong Kong has kind of been canceled. So where do you go? Singapore? Maybe it's really expensive and it's steeped in corporate politics. So Seoul suddenly becomes a very good option for international entertainment entities.
And when you mentioned like all these other, London and LA, for example, Hollywood looking to now produce in Korea, is there a danger that kind of old traditional culture in America, the old white men controlling Hollywood, is there a danger that can potentially come into Korea or take root or fester?
I hope not. I think that would be extremely destructive. I don't know. There are still some very traditional Korean institutions that are destructive to creative free expression. You still see very strongly marginalized minorities here. There's the Muslim community is extremely marginalized. The Black community is extremely marginalized. Southeast Asian communities are marginalized and exploited. And The LGBT community is extremely marginalized here. These types of diversities are extremely important in the advancement of media because that's where you find new stories and new creative influence. I think I'm more concerned that traditional Korean institutions will try to mitigate that diversity because it's not good for the gentrification of Korea. But again, this is now becoming an outdated belief. It's older generations of Korean conservative men who grew up with 40 years of consistent generational sort of sociology that is now suddenly changing, and young generations feel a completely different way. Someone under the age of 25 in Korea and someone over the age of 50 in Korea live in two completely different countries with two completely different worldviews and two completely different ideologies. It's what happens in that gap over the next decade that is very important and will also be very interesting to watch.
Oh, that's great to hear. Well, thank you very much, Scott, for coming on.
Sure. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us on this interview. I hope you guys learned a lot about Korean media and how Korean media is influencing the world. I hope to see you next time.